Infauna. Are these sediment dwellers the key to unlocking IRL restoration? Today we will discuss benthic infauna and how these small creatures could be the key to understanding successful restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. Infauna, what is it and why is it important on this episode of One Lagoon, One Voice?
Hi, I'm Dwayne DeFries, Executive Director of the IRL Council and the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. Welcome to our One Lagoon, One Voice podcast. Each week, myself or one of my staff members will host leaders in the community, scientists along the lagoon, people who know a lot about the system to talk about some of the problems and, most importantly, some of the solutions to solve the Indian River Lagoon's health and make sure it's great for future generations. So let's get the show started and let's talk a little lagoon.
Welcome everyone to today's episode. I'm Daniel Kolodny, the Chief Operating Officer of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. To help discuss infauna and all the amazing things we are learning about them, we have Dr. Holly Sweat from the Smithsonian Marine Station in Fort Pierce with us today. Holly is a marine biologist who specializes in biodiversity and benthic ecosystems. Holly, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm happy to be here.
We're glad to have you. Holly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Smithsonian, all the work you do there?
Sure. So I lead the benthic ecology lab here at the Smithsonian Marine Station in Fort Pierce, Florida. And benthic is just another word for bottom dwelling. So we focus on all of the organisms that live on the seafloor, on the estuary floor, and how they interact with their environment. So I lead a group of people through various different projects that focus on benthic ecology, which I'll get more into later on today. And I've been working in the lagoon system for about 23 years now, basically my entire career. And a lot of that has been with the Smithsonian. So I've really come to be connected with the lagoon and really invested in making sure that it's sustainable and that it's healthy.
Excellent. Thank you. So before we dive into this discussion today, I just kind of want to shamelessly plug one of our other episodes and let our listeners know if they haven't already listened to episode 18, Get the Muck Out of Here, that this discussion today that I'm having with you is actually kind of not only will be an amazing standalone podcast, but it was a follow-up to that discussion I had with Austin. It was, really interesting. We were talking about sediment and how to fix and make it healthy. And we talked about infaunal communities, and it came up in that discussion, and it gave me an idea for our next podcast. I said, we got to get Dr. Holly Sweat here to talk about that. So, well, here we are, and we're talking infauna today. So now that we get into infauna and benthic infauna, can you kind of tell me a little bit about what kinds are there?
There's so much. I guess I should probably back up a little bit. This goes back into my my career history a little bit, but I'm a child of the 80s and early 90s. And so I grew up watching things like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And I was just immediately blown away by the idea that our perception of the world around us is shaped by our size. And there are things that are going on that make the world go round that we never see. It's happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We would not exist without these things happening. And yet we really don't know a whole lot about them. And so everything that I study with infauna and all of the other tiny organisms that we look at, it all kind of goes into that whole idea of these little animals helping to shape the world around us, making it possible for us to have a clean environment, putting food on our table, all sorts of things. So there are lots of different types of infauna that play different roles that help to engineer the world around us. So we've got organisms like worms. Kind of think about the earthworms in your garden, for example. We have the same sorts of worms in the marine environment that will burrow around in the sediment. We have shrimp and shrimp relatives that are going to be at the top of the sediment and climbing on the seagrass and, going up and down in grass beds and other habitats. We've got snails and then a whole lot of other organisms that you probably have never heard of before because they're, very small groups, but there is so much diversity there and they all play important roles. Like, just for example, I have somebody in my lab that's their entire career is focused on studying microturbularian flatworms. So these are tiny, tiny little worms that live between grains of sand. That's how small they are.
Wow.
But they are one of the most abundant organisms in sand and mud. When you go out and you walk in the lagoon, they're super abundant under your feet. And they have all sorts of different services that they provide, from cycling nutrients to just making the sediments healthier. So yeah, I could go on and on. There's so many different types of infauna. I'm sure we'll get into details about some of those today.
For sure. So you told us a little bit about, where they live. Are there preferred conditions that they like? Are there any outliers? Like most of them live on top. Are there some that prefer different areas?
There are, yes. So I'm probably going to be bringing this back to discussions of land-based ecosystems a lot because it's
Right.
easier for us to connect with. So I'll be talking about like what happens in your backyard, what happens in your garden. Those processes are very much the same in marine environments. We just don't see them because they're under the surface of the water. So like you have in your yard, there's a lot of infauna, a lot of organisms that are happy pretty much anywhere. They're what we call generalists. So they can survive in really clean sand, sediments that are what we would consider pristine, nice beach sand. They also can live in mucky, muddy, kind of gross environments as well.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have some that are more like our weeds. They can live everywhere, but they tend to do really well in those bad environments because they're the only things that can survive. And so they don't have any competition from other stuff.
Gotcha.
And then we have some other things that are really sensitive. And so they're going to be indicators of nice, healthy environments. Things like orchids and other, sort of rare plants in your yard. We have infauna that are like that are only going to pop up when the environment is healthy.
Gotcha. I assume most of these infauna need aerobic conditions. Are there any that can survive in anaerobic? And that means, with oxygen or without oxygen.
Yeah, so most of them are going to need large amounts of oxygen, but there are a bunch that can survive with very little and even sometimes no oxygen for short periods of time. So we have certain species that have the ability to sort of, no pun intended, kind of clam up whenever there's no oxygen around or whenever there's, inhospitable conditions, and they can kind of wait it out. And we also have some animals that have the ability to withstand some of the sort of chemical byproducts of having a really low oxygen environment. So when we don't have oxygen, we can have microbial or bacterial processes that produce things like toxic hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell that you
Yep.
get whenever you go out in the lagoon and you smell sediments that don't have oxygen. That can kill most things. But we have some infauna that are specialized to be able to live in that. There's a clam, for example, that we study in my lab called, the scientific name is Millennia lateralis. It's called the dwarf surf clam, I think. And it has the ability to withstand hydrogen sulfide concentrations that are many, many times higher than we can withstand. They can live for days in concentrations that would kill us in a few minutes. So,
Wow, that's impressive.
yeah.
And I know we're going to touch about this later, when we talk about healthy sediments and, muck and that kind of stuff. So just really interesting to hear about all the different types of conditions these little fellows can live in. So really interesting stuff. I think what really has got me so excited about this topic is that, when we think about biodiversity and species discovery, this is a frontier that hasn't been fully explored. I was so fascinated at the last symposium to hear about, new species still being discovered. How is this possible that we don't know about all these species?
Yeah. So we are fortunate in the Indian River Lagoon to be in a place that's really well studied. And we've had things like the Indian River Lagoon species inventory that's existed for decades now, and a lot of other work in the lagoon that has allowed us to create an inventory and to take stock of how much diversity we have. But we are still finding so many more species because we are starting to look in habitats that have been understudied for all of scientific history.
Right.
So it's hard to study these small things. Of course, you need specialized equipment, you need certain microscopes, you need certain ways
Sure.
of collecting, and then you need a lot of taxonomic or identification expertise. So people train for years to be able to study some of these different groups, and there's only a handful of folks worldwide that can identify certain types of species. So luckily, we've had a lot of folks that have those areas of expertise come and work in the lagoon recently. And so they're shedding light on this sort of black box of organisms that we didn't know we had.
That's amazing. So, what does all this new info mean? All these new species. What does it tell us about the lagoon and what's going on in these sediments?
I think we're at very early days of figuring out the potential of all the things that these species can tell us about our environment, because some of these are new to science. So within the last few months, for example, we've had folks here at the Smithsonian Marine Station that have identified probably at least 50 different species that we think are new to science. So
Wow.
we don't
Wow.
know a whole lot about them yet because we're just now getting descriptions and putting names on them. So the ecology will come whenever we have time to further explore the role of these animals in their environment. But I think we can learn a few different things from this. We know generally what these different groups of organisms do in their environment, and we know it's always good to have higher diversity because that can buffer an ecosystem from change. So things like climate change and pollution and urbanization and stuff like that. If you've got a more diverse ecosystem, then there are going to be organisms that can take the place of others that might die off from a particular disturbance event. So it's always good to have more species. So just discovery of learning how much diversity we have in the lagoon, but also eventually understanding how these different species can provide different services to help keep our ecosystem healthy.
Right.
So it seems like we should know everything, but turns out we don't.
Yeah. But what you do know is really important to this point, and so it's a good way to kind of transition into why we know infauna is so important. So let's talk about the health of our sediments and talking about restoration. The lagoon's gone through so much degradation over the past decade and so much seagrass loss. And so when we're talking about sediments and keys to future restoration, when I was talking with Austin, we were really talking about, how do we get these sediments so that they're healthy, don't have that hydrogen sulfide, which is a big factor that plays into seagrass loss and recovery. How do these infaunas impact that sediment health?
So many different ways. I'm going to go back to the whole earthworm analogy. If you are a gardener, you know that you need certain organisms in your sediment, like earthworms, like beneficial insect larvae, and things like that to help make the sediment healthy. Same thing is happening in the lagoon. Let's say, for example, we've got an area where there's been a whole lot of fertilizers dumped into the lagoon and lots of algae blooms, lots of grass clippings from your yard, and all of that stuff has settled down on the lagoon floor and kind of blanketed it with this muck layer.
Mm-hmm.
Not very much can live there. There's only going to be a handful of animals that can withstand those conditions. And obviously, we're not going to have things like seagrass growing in those sediments. And so, infauna have the ability, some of those more robust organisms that can withstand those conditions have the ability to come in, and they're what we call sort of pioneering species. They can handle the low oxygen, the hydrogen sulfide, anything we want to dish at them. They're kind of like the cockroaches of the ocean. And they'll come in and they will get to work, and they have the ability, as long as we're not, throwing more nutrients at them and throwing more hurdles at them, they can help to restore those sediments, because they will burrow through them, and the burrowing activity can do what's called bioturbation. So that helps basically just to mix up the sediment. It helps oxygenate the sediment. It helps to move nutrients around so that the microbes can get at those nutrients and decomposition can happen more effectively. Some of them have the ability to improve water quality because they can filter the water and bring all of those particles that are in the water column down onto the seafloor. And all of that is going to make sediments healthier and condition them for things that are more sensitive and rarer, so that eventually you get this kind of what we call succession happening, where over time you've got a greater diversity of infauna. And when you have lots of different types of infauna, then you're going to have healthy sediments. And then you can start to have things like seagrass recruitment and other big organisms moving in, and fish and other large predators that eat these infauna moving in and taking advantage of the habitat.
So these guys are truly like almost the base of the food web, the
Yes.
start of that whole system. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I think another thing people need to realize is that, a lot of these guys, they don't move very quickly, right? They're kind of stay in the same place. There's a few that can move around, but so that's going to make this take a long time, right? To recover.
Yeah, it can take a long time. I always like to say that they're literally stuck in the mud. They can't go anywhere. And that's why we use them as indicators of environmental health, because they mirror the world around them better than something that's really mobile, like a fish
Right.
or a large crustacean. They don't move around very much, but a lot of them reproduce pretty rapidly. So if we do restore conditions enough that it supports their reproduction, then there is the potential to have at least these early pioneers kind of colonize pretty quickly.
Gotcha. That's great. So you kind of touched on it briefly. They can change the chemistry of the sediments to make it more suitable. Can you dive a little bit deeper into that and how that, because that was something that was so fascinating, that they can change chemistry of sediments and make it more conducive, and just go a little bit more into that.
So one of those ways is just by oxygenating the sediments when they're digging around, especially the deep burrowers that have the ability to go from the surface of the sediment several inches down, where we don't get any oxygen
Right.
in the sediments. They can just change the chemistry profile and reduce that toxic hydrogen sulfide just by injecting oxygen into the sediment. But they also have this unique ability to kind of almost farm or culture different microbial or bacterial communities in the sediment. There are certain infauna that have associations with different types of bacteria, and or their behavior just kind of supports building a more healthy and diverse bacterial community, which also helps with cycling excess nutrients, and that improves the chemistry of the sediments. So you can kind of think of it like after you take an antibiotic and you've completely flushed your digestive system of all of the good bacteria, then you have to go in and take a probiotic so you can build all of that back up. So the infauna are kind of like a probiotic. They're sort of helping to reestablish that healthy bacterial community that helps with sediment chemistry profiles.
That's fascinating. So now that we know some of the positive impacts that infauna creates to our sediments, let's talk a little bit about the negatives and what are some of the things that can harm them. And so, we kind of already talked about muck a little bit. But let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those topics. So, hypoxia, nutrient fluxes, hydrogen sulfide.
Yeah, most of those things that you just mentioned, they all go back to sedimentation. And so that's going to happen whenever we have a lot of inland runoff. So we get a big storm event, weeks of rain, and sediment from the soil from our yard goes in the storm drains. It ends up in the lagoon. We have fertilizers that are going into the lagoon and causing algae blooms. And once that algae dies, that settles down onto the bottom of the lagoon. Most of our watershed eventually flows into the lagoon. So think of all of the stuff that's churned up in the water column that eventually has to settle out. And so we call that sedimentation. It's just basically the raining down of all of this material onto the bottom of the lagoon. And that can smother these animals, especially if it happens really fast. Because think about being an animal that's only about a quarter of an inch long. If you have, over the course of a couple of weeks, an inch or 2 inches or 3 inches of mud that accumulates on top of you, you got to keep burrowing upward, climbing upward to the top of that each day just to get some oxygen and keep from getting smothered. So some of these animals, because they're so small, they can't outpace the sedimentation that's happening. And more sedimentation means lower oxygen and more hydrogen sulfide. And that all happens because of the microbial community, the bacterial community, and the decomposition that's happening with all of the stuff that's raining out of the water column.
Gotcha. And it's just like a negative feedback loop where it just makes it worse and worse and worse. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that's one of the big harms to infauna is that sediment quality, that sedimentation. The other big harm, arguably in some parts of our lagoon, the dominant driver of infauna health is going to be salinity swings.
And that can also come from rain events. You get these big, large pulses can have these huge swings in salinity. So yeah, so they're both tied almost to the same thing.
Yeah. And especially in our southern lagoon and places like the St. Lucie Estuary, where we have releases sometimes from Lake Okeechobee and from some of our tributaries, we're going to get these really big thousands and thousands of liters of fresh water that are coming off the land. And that's going to drive the entire water column. Even if we have meters of depth, it can drive it from marine to fresh over the course of, a few days, few hours. And that can wipe them out if they're not used to dealing with those swings.
How resilient are some of these infauna to those swings?
It kind of depends on what the species are. So we have a group of species that are pretty resilient. A lot of them are the ones that are also resilient to things like hydrogen sulfide and low oxygen.
Right.
But we also have others that are, a lot of them, especially in the healthier sites, in the more diverse sites, that are pretty truly marine. So they live near the inlets, or they live in areas where we don't get a lot of freshwater influence, and they can't handle it. They're going to be wiped out pretty quickly.
So now that we know a little bit about what they can do for our sediments and helping to improve and all the things that they can't handle, what are some actions that our listeners could take to help these infauna? Obviously, taking care of their own yards is a big one and their own inputs to the lagoon, but is there other things that they could do to help our little bottom-dwelling creatures?
Obviously, doing anything you can do within your own routine, within your own life to reduce your input to the lagoon. I know sometimes it seems to get a little bit daunting or overwhelming. We're like, oh, how are we going to fix this problem? No matter what I do, nothing's going to help. But every little bit goes a long way. So if you can reduce your inputs to storm drains and reduce your fertilizer use and things like that, that's going to help. But also by supporting things like muck dredging projects in areas where we've had lots of muck accumulation, that can help. Supporting research and supporting monitoring. My lab does a lot of environmental monitoring. That's what we use all of these infaunal communities for. And sometimes monitoring gets a bad rap, but it's absolutely necessary for us to understand the health of our lagoon, where we are now, where we have been in the past, and where we're going. We can't figure out a trajectory and forecast what the lagoon is going to be like in the future if we don't have good long-term data. So supporting that and getting involved with monitoring efforts. There's a lot of citizen science efforts throughout the lagoon. So get out there, get involved with institutions, organizations that are doing work on the lagoon. And beyond that, just get out there and use the lagoon. Become familiar with it, have an appreciation for it. And that is going to help spread the word throughout your community of what a unique resource this is. And I think that that's how we get started in conserving everything, is to get everybody on board, because we're all in this together. It's not just a scientist problem. It's not just a particular neighborhood issue. Everybody that lives here has to get involved.
For sure. And that sense of stewardship is obviously key to everything. But I do want to, you touched on two things that are really important that I think can go a long way in helping promote that sense of stewardship. And that's, that monitoring and seeing firsthand the outcomes of some of that, like muck dredging, for example. They have sampled the infaunal community before, and like you said, there's very few that can live in that. And then after the muck dredging, I know I talked with Austin about this in Turkey Creek. They dredged all the muck, and then immediately we started to see more infaunal communities start to come back up. So, that's one of those ways to just, okay, this works. I monitored it before, monitored it after, it's working.
And I think that also helps people appreciate trying to reduce the inputs into the lagoon, because we can have a muck dredging project every year.
Forever. Yeah.
And we're never going to get rid of it if we keep pumping it into the lagoon.
Right. Got to stop it at the source.
Yeah. If you can see the benefits of the dredging and what stopping that sedimentation is going to do, I think it goes a long way toward turning off the tap of all the inputs too.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk infauna. I've been super excited. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our discussion before we wrap it up?
Well, I guess I'd probably like to plug the Indian River Lagoon Species Inventory. If you haven't been on there before, it's irlspecies.org. It is the most comprehensive database of information on species and habitats for the Indian River Lagoon system. So if you're out there and you're beachcombing or just kicking around in the lagoon and you want to identify something that you found, you can hop on there and that can help you out. Aside from that, just thank you so much for giving me a platform to nerd out for a little bit and talk about these animals.
Yeah, I love talking about these. Does the Smithsonian have any socials that anybody can follow? Just curious.
We do. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. My lab is on Instagram. We're at Smithsonian Benthic Ecology. We just had a benthic BioBlitz, which is basically a scientific scavenger hunt for a lot of these organisms that go sort of understudied. Over the last 2 weeks, we invited about 30 experts from lots of different locations here to help us go out, collect, identify, catalog, photograph, and take tissue samples from about 1,800 different specimens from 32 sites in the lagoon. So we went from sort of the Sebastian Vero area all the way down to Jupiter Inlet. We did a little bit of nearshore sampling as well. And our goal was to obviously catalog species and sort of increase that tally of organisms we know about from the watershed, but also to get DNA sequences of all of these animals, because we can use those to flesh out these public DNA sequence databases that are used for something called environmental DNA, which is probably like a whole other podcast episode.
Awesome. Any new species during the BioBlitz?
Oh, so many new species. We probably have over 100 records that are new for the lagoon. And we probably have dozens that are new to science.
Excellent. I'll just add, I love that species inventory webpage. I use it all the time, and I love that you guys are adding constantly new species, new features, new tools for the public to be able to help identify and see what kind of species are out there. So it's really quite an amazing website.
Thank you. Well, we couldn't do it without the help of the IRL NEPA too. So thanks a lot. We're going to continue to grow it, and hopefully it'll become a resource that's just better and better and better every year.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Holly.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy these discussions about the Indian River Lagoon, please like and subscribe to this podcast. To learn more about the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, how you can get involved, and tips on living lagoon friendly, or to purchase One Lagoon merchandise, visit us at onelagoon.org. Also, our newly redesigned Indian River Lagoon license plate is now available at your local tag office. To stay informed about lagoon news and upcoming events, like our monthly What's Up in the Watershed webinar, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at One Lagoon.